You've noticed it, haven't you? The more you try, the less happens. It's not lack of effort. The effort is all there. It's something else. And you feel it. There is a mechanism that most people never examine. Not because it's hidden, but because it's so close it goes unnoticed. Like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The mind that wants to change something is the same mind that created what you want to change. Think about that for a moment. Not as metaphor, as structure. If the pattern that generated a result is active inside you, and you use that same pattern to try to alter the result, you're not creating something new. You're reinforcing what already exists with different vocabulary. You call it manifestation, intention, visualization. But the engine underneath all of it is the same: tension, urgency, the feeling that something is missing. And it's precisely that feeling of lack that keeps projecting outward. Not because reality is cruel, but because there is a very precise coherence between what you are internally and what appears externally. A coherence that doesn't respond to what you say you want. It responds to what you are while wanting it. That distinction is small in the sentence. It's enormous in practice. Isabella was 32 years old and spent entire mornings repeating affirmations in front of the bathroom mirror. She had a specific notebook for it, black cover, gold letters. She wrote the phrases carefully, said them aloud, visualized, felt or tried to feel. But there was a detail she never noticed until that Tuesday morning, when the faucet dripped in an irregular rhythm and she looked at herself in the reflection and noticed something. Her shoulders, always contracted, even while saying she was fine, even while affirming abundance. Her body was rigid, like someone bracing for impact. She put down the notebook, didn't throw it away, just put it down. She stood there, looking at the reflection without doing anything. Without repeating anything, without trying anything, and in that silence, not forced peace, but genuine pause, she realized for the first time that she had been screaming internally for months, in elegant whispers and well-written affirmations. But screaming. Isabella's story doesn't end in a miracle. It ends in observation. And that's exactly where everything begins to reorganize. The problem isn't that you don't know what you want. The problem is that you want from a state that makes it impossible to receive what you want. Let me be more precise. When you want something intensely, the intensity itself carries information that it isn't here yet. And while you operate from the experience of absence, even if it's absence of something desired, you're emitting a very specific signal to the field around you. A signal that says, lack. That says, not yet. That says, I'm waiting. And what you receive back is coherent with that. Not as punishment, as logic. Think about how a feedback system works. Any system, you insert data. The system processes. The system returns a result coherent with the data inserted. If the data inserted is lack of something, the result processed is keeps lacking. Most manifestation techniques try to hack the result without altering the input data. And that's why they fail systematically. You visualize abundance while feeling scarcity. You repeat phrases of health while the body carries the pattern of illness. You affirm prosperous relationships while the internal identity still organizes itself around loneliness. The system isn't processing what you say. It's processing what you are. Here is what I call the 0 point, or, to be more exact, the neutral field of perception. It's not a spiritual state. It's a functional state. It's the point where the mind stops creating narrative. Stops interpreting, stops projecting, stops defending, stops trying to prove something, It's when the system rests from its own activity. And in that rest, not of exhaustion but of conscious suspension, the input data changes. Because you're no longer inserting lack. You're inserting nothing. You're in the absence of active identity, in silence of processing. And it's precisely there that the system responds differently. Not because you asked, because you stopped asking from a state of deficiency. Let's dismantle this from another angle. Because the logic needs to be verified from multiple perspectives before it's understood in practice. There is a difference between resting and giving up. Most people, when they hear "stop trying," interpret it as abandonment, as passivity, as resignation. But observe carefully. Giving up is an emotional state. Resting is a structural state. When you give up, there's still charge, still frustration, still the story of "this doesn't work for me," still an active identity now defeated but still functioning. When you rest in the absence of active identity, there's no narrative, no victory or defeat, no story about yourself being told in that moment. There's a technical difference, and that difference is everything. The neutral field isn't nihilism. It's temporary suspension of interpretation. Like when you wake in the middle of the night between sleep and waking, and for a moment you don't exactly know who you are, where you are, what you need to solve. There's only awareness, without specific content, without a role to fulfill. That state lasts seconds for most people. And then the mind reorganizes. I'm me. I'm in my room. I have a meeting tomorrow. But in those seconds, in that interval, you were at 0 point. And if you could learn to access that interval intentionally, without losing consciousness, what would change? The answer that most philosophical traditions and systems of understanding the mind converge on, each with different language, is everything. Not dramatically, not instantly, but gradually and coherently. Because you begin inserting a different datum into the system. Not, I want this because it's missing. Not, I affirm that because I need it to be true. But something closer to absence of position, absence of narrative, open field. And the system, receiving that datum, processes something different. Not because there was magic, but because the coherence of the system is impeccable. The result will always correspond to the state of the emitter. If the emitter is in tension, the result will contain tension. If the emitter is in neutrality, in genuine neutral field, the result will contain openness. But here arises a paradox worth examining. If I know I need to be in neutral field to create different results, and then I make effort to reach the neutral field, I'm using tension to create neutrality. And that doesn't work. You can't force the absence of effort. It's a structural contradiction. So how does one access the genuine null state? Not by arriving at it, but by recognizing that it already exists. Observe again. Between each thought, there is a gap. Between each word you speak, there is space. Between each emotion that arises and the next, there is an interval. The neutral field isn't a destination. It's the underlying structure of all experience. You don't create the silence. You stop creating the noise that covers it. And that changes everything about how the practice works. It's not adding a technique to the day. It's removing the layer of compulsive processing that's happening all the time. The human mind processes, on average, somewhere between 6,000 and 60,000 thoughts per day, depending on the study you consult. The exact number doesn't matter. What matters is that the vast majority of those thoughts are repetition, variation of the same set of themes, the same fears in new packaging, the same hopes with slightly different vocabulary. The same patterns repeating while the mind believes it's seeking new solutions. And each of those thoughts is inserting data into the system. Each repeated pattern is being processed and returned as result. This means changing the external result without altering the internal pattern is mathematically impossible. Not metaphorically, structurally. What appears outside is a reading of what operates inside. And the reading will be precise, will be coherent, will be exact. So the question isn't, how do I manifest what I want? The question is, how do I alter the pattern being processed? And the answer, which contradicts almost everything the personal development industry sells, is not to add more patterns on top. It's to find the space where patterns stop operating. I'll use a technical analogy because it makes this more precise. Imagine a computer processor under overload. Many processes running simultaneously. The system starts to freeze. Response becomes slow. Results become unpredictable. The standard solution most people apply to their own mind is add more processes, more techniques, more affirmations, more visualizations, more practices, more reading, more workshops. That's the equivalent of opening more tabs in an already frozen browser. What the system needs isn't more input. It's a moment of reinitialization, of absence of active processing. The neutral field is that moment. And when the system restarts from zero without the old patterns still loaded, it begins to operate with a different set of data. With what's present now, not with what was repeatedly processed in the past. That's the mechanism. It's not esoteric. It's functional. But there is a very specific resistance that appears here. And it's worth naming precisely because it silently sabotages most attempts to access the null state. The resistance is called identity, not in the abstract philosophical sense. In the very concrete sense of, you have a story about who you are. And that story includes your problems, your patterns, your struggles, your past achievements, your past failures, your expectations, your fears. And that story is processed continuously. It's like a system file that's always running in the background. When you try to access the neutral field, the identity interprets this as threat. Because genuine neutrality includes neutrality toward one's own story, toward one's own self-narrative. And that generates a very specific internal conflict. The part of you that wants to change and the part of you that defines itself by the patterns it wants to change. The result of this conflict is oscillation. You access moments of lightness and then the identity pulls back. You feel clarity and then the familiar pattern returns. You have a different day and then life goes back to the previous script. Not because you're weak, but because identity is doing what identities do, maintaining coherence with itself. So what happens when you stop trying to dissolve identity by force? When you stop declaring internal war on your own patterns? When you simply observe identity happening, without merging with it and without fighting it? Something subtle occurs. The identity begins to lose density, not because it was attacked, but because it was observed without being fed. It's an extremely important technical distinction. Fighting a pattern feeds it, because to fight you need to engage. And engagement is attention, and attention is the fuel of any mental pattern. Observing a pattern without merging with it, without completely believing that you are the pattern, begins a different process. The pattern keeps appearing. But you notice that you are the one observing, not the one being the pattern. And that distance, even minimal, is already a structural alteration in the system. Let me make this more concrete. Think of a thought you have repeatedly. Could be about money, about relationship, about your ability to create something. any recurring pattern. Normally, when that thought appears, you enter it. Begin to elaborate. Begin to solve. Begin to feel the associated emotional charge. The thought grows, occupies space, generates other related thoughts. That is fusion with the pattern. You and the thought become the same thing for a few moments. Now imagine noticing the thought arising, and simply noting that it arose, without entering, without elaborating, without solving, without rejecting. Just, this thought is here, and then waiting, and observing. What happens to a thought that isn't fed by engaged attention? It loses intensity, naturally, not because you forced it away, but because thoughts, like any pattern, need engagement to sustain themselves. That's the basic mechanics of what I call conscious non-action. It's not passivity. It's a very active form of presence that refuses to feed automatic patterns. And here we reach a deeper layer. Conscious non-action isn't just a thought management technique. It's an alteration in the relationship between the observer and the observed. When you observe a thought without merging with it, you're implicitly recognizing something. You are not the thought. There is something, whatever you wish to call it, that is capable of perceiving the thought without being the thought. This seems obvious stated that way, but in practice, most people live completely merged with their flow of thoughts and emotions. There's no distance, no observer. There's only the content. And when there's only content, no observer, the system functions in automatic mode. Patterns run unsupervised. Results keep being the same because the input data keeps being the same. The moment the observer emerges, even briefly, even unstably, is the moment the possibility of altering the pattern exists. Not because the observer does something, but because the emergence of the observer is already in itself a different state. There is a word from Taoist thought that captures this better than any Western explanation I know, Wu Wei, usually translated as non-action or acting without acting. But the most precise translation, in the context I'm describing, would be something like acting in alignment with what is without imposing what should be. It's not passivity. The bamboo practices Wu Wei when it bends with the wind and returns to natural position. There is movement. There is response. But there's no forced resistance and no collapse. The mind that operates from the neutral field responds to what's present without carrying the weight of the entire history of patterns that normally filter perception. It sees with more clarity, acts with more precision, creates with less friction, not because it reached some elevated spiritual state, but because it reduced the processing noise to the minimum necessary to function. I want to examine now something rarely discussed when talking about internal state and creation of results: the role of coherence. Coherence, in the sense I'm using, isn't emotional consistency. It's not feeling good all the time. It's something more structural. The alignment between what you perceive internally and what your action expresses externally. Most people live in chronic incoherence. Not because they're dishonest, but because they operate from different layers of themselves simultaneously, without noticing. One layer wants something. Another layer fears it. A third layer believes it doesn't deserve it. A fourth layer is trying to convince the others that everything will be fine. And these layers emit conflicting signals. The external system receives a chaotic signal and returns chaotic results. Coherence isn't having only positive thoughts. It's reducing internal conflict until the layers begin to operate in similar directions. And the most efficient way to create coherence isn't to resolve each layer separately. It's to descend below all of them, to the point of absence of identity where the layers aren't active, and begin from there. That's the engineering. It's not mystical. It's structure. But let me anticipate an objection that normally arises here. Daniel, all of this sounds very good as concept, but how does this pay a bill? How does this improve a relationship? How does this solve a concrete problem? Direct answer: the neutral field doesn't solve problems for you. It alters the state from which you solve problems. And that's an enormous difference. When you act from tension, you create solutions loaded with tension that frequently generate other problems, or that resolve the immediate problem but preserve the pattern that created it. When you act from the neutral field, even briefly, even imperfectly, the solutions that arise tend to be different, simpler, less loaded, more aligned with what the situation actually calls for, instead of what your history of patterns projects. It's not that the problem disappears. It's that your response to the problem changes. And how you respond to the problem determines the next state of the system. I want to go deeper into the mechanics because they deserve detailed attention. There's a concept in complex systems called an attractor. An attractor is a state toward which a system tends to return, regardless of external perturbations. Your mind has attractors, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral patterns to which it returns repeatedly. That's why you solve a problem and a similar one appears. That's why you leave a relationship with a certain pattern and enter the next one with the same pattern in new packaging. That's why you change jobs, but the same dynamic repeats. The attractor isn't in the job, isn't in the relationship. It's in the system, which is you. Most approaches to change try to alter surface behavior without touching the attractor. The result is inevitable. The system returns to the pattern. What happens when you access the neutral field consistently? The attractor begins to lose strength. Not all at once, but gradually, as you spend more time in the absence of active identity, the system begins to reorganize around a different equilibrium point. This takes time. It's not instantaneous. It's not a dramatic turn. It's a process of gradual reorganization of the system. And during that process, you'll notice that old situations begin to appear less frequently, that old patterns take longer to surface, that you react differently before noticing you reacted differently. Those are signs that the attractor is changing. There's a very common misunderstanding about what it means to let go of something. Letting go has become a popular term. Everyone says, "I need to let this go." But what most people do when they try to let go is force relaxation. Tell themselves they're no longer attached. Try to convince the surface layers that there's no more problem. That isn't letting go. It's suppression. And what is suppressed doesn't disappear. It becomes compressed. And when pressure increases, it returns with doubled force. Genuine letting go has no effort, has no decision to let go, has no voluntary act of release. What happens is this: when you stop feeding something with engaged attention, when you observe without merging, the pattern naturally loses the intensity that kept it compressed. It doesn't explode or disappear. It simply dissolves, like fog when the sun warms. Not because you did something, because you stopped doing the thing that kept it compact. That's Wu Wei applied to internal psychology. And it has profound consequences for how you understand change. Let's talk about time, because that question appears inevitably. When will it work? How long until I see results? The question itself reveals the pattern. Because, when will it work, is inserting into the system the datum of, it hasn't worked yet. It's reinforcing the waiting narrative of absence. I'm not saying this to be cruel or to create an inescapable paradox. I'm pointing toward an important perception. The quality of the question determines the quality of the internal state that accompanies it. A different question would be, what is present now? Not as denial of what you want, but as reorientation of attentions focused toward what's real in this moment, instead of what doesn't yet exist. And when focus is on the present, genuinely not as forced technique, the data inserted in the system changes. It's no longer lack, it's presence. This doesn't resolve all problems instantly, but it begins to reorganize what the system processes. There's an even subtler layer I want to examine before moving on. The identity has a very specific investment in certain problems. This seems contradictory. Why would identity invest in problems? But observe carefully. Some problems define who you are. I'm a person who struggles with money. I'm someone who doesn't have luck in relationships. I'm creative but never manage to make my ideas viable. These narratives aren't just explanations of situations. They're components of identity. And identity as a system tends to preserve itself. So it will, in subtle and unconscious ways, maintain the conditions that allow the narrative to keep being true. Not out of malice, out of systemic coherence. And when you try to resolve the problem without examining the identity investment in it, you're working against the current of the system. The system will resist, will forget the new practices, will create circumstances that reactivate the old pattern. What happens when you observe the identity investment without judgment? When you notice, there's a part of me that defines itself by this problem? The observation itself begins to create distance, doesn't automatically resolve it, but opens space for the system to reorganize differently. There's an architecture of the neutral field that's never explicitly discussed, and that makes all the difference for those trying to apply this. The neutral field isn't a state you visit once and maintain permanently. It's accessed in intervals, in windows, in moments of conscious pause within the normal flow of life. And each window, even lasting only a few minutes, has cumulative effect on the system. Think about how sleep works. You don't resolve all problems while sleeping. But during sleep, the system consolidates, processes, discards what's unnecessary, and prepares to operate more efficiently in the waking state. The neutral field works analogously. Each genuine access allows the system to rest from compulsive processing, release unnecessary charge, and emerge with more clarity. Over time, and this time varies greatly from person to person, the neutral field begins to contaminate other states. The baseline noise level begins to decrease. Automatic reactivity begins to reduce. Clarity begins to be available in situations where before there was only automatic pattern. That isn't enlightenment. It's system adjustment. I want to speak now about the difference between intention and fixation, because that's where most people lose the thread. Intention is a direction. It's recognizing what you prefer without carrying the emotional weight that it must happen in a specific way, in a specific time frame, through specific circumstances. Fixation is intention with charge, this wanting urgently, with fear that it won't happen, with the entire emotional system invested in the specific result. The difference between the two isn't in the content of what's wanted. It's in the internal state of the one wanting. Someone in neutral field can have very clear intentions, can know exactly what they prefer to create, can act toward that with decision and precision. But the internal state isn't organized around the absence of the result. It's in balance with the present while moving toward the preferred. This is radically different from fixation, and the system responds in a radically different way. Fixation inserts not yet into the system. Intention without fixation inserts direction into the system. One creates result coherent with deficiency. The other creates result coherent with movement. There is a paradox that appears frequently in the practice of the null state, and it's so common it deserves specific attention. The paradox is this: the more you practice the neutral field with the goal of creating results, the less neutral you actually are. Because you're using neutrality as instrument, which means there's an expected result, which means there's an implicit charge of it needs to work. And that charge, however subtle, is still a datum inserted in the system. How do you resolve this? You don't. You observe it. You notice that you're using the neutral field instrumentally. And then, if possible, you let go also of the objective that the neutral field work. You practice simply because the neutral field is, in itself, a more coherent state to exist in, regardless of the results it generates. And paradoxically, as almost everything in this sphere, when you release the instrumental objective, the neutral field begins to function more efficiently. Because now it's genuinely neutral. It's not being used. It's being inhabited. I want to describe what the absence of active identity feels like in practice, because the conceptual description only goes so far. It's not darkness. It's not emptiness in the frightening sense. It's not numbness. It's closer to presence without specific content, awareness without theme, attention that isn't fixed on any particular object. You still exist. You still perceive. But for a few moments, there's no story about who you are being told. No role being played. No problem being solved. No future being planned or past being revisited. There's only the field where all of that normally happens, without any of it happening now. This state is far more accessible than it seems. You pass through it several times a day without noticing. Between activities, at the start of an involuntary deep breath, in the moment before sleep, in the instant when you finish a task and haven't yet started the next. The practice isn't creating that state. It's beginning to recognize it when it occurs naturally, and then gradually learning to remain in it for slightly longer periods, with a little more consciousness, with a little less hurry to return to content. There's a practical consequence of the null state that's rarely mentioned. It improves the quality of decisions, not because you receive special information, but because decisions made from the neutral field are less contaminated by the noise of old patterns. They respond more to what's present and less to what history projects. Most human decisions aren't made based on the current situation. They're made based on how similar past situations were processed, which means you're frequently responding to a ghost of past experience while believing you're responding to the present situation. The neutral field reduces that interference. Doesn't eliminate it completely, that would take much more practice time, but reduces it enough so that the decision is more aligned with what's actually happening. And decisions more aligned with reality tend to generate results more aligned with what you prefer. Again, it's not magic. It's reduction of noise in the processing system. I want to touch on a point that many people find difficult. The null state can be uncomfortable at first, not because it's dangerous, but because when the noise decreases, you begin to perceive things the noise was covering. Suppressed emotions that were never processed. Thought patterns that were too automatic to be noticed. Bodily tensions that had become invisible from being so constant. That isn't the neutral field going wrong. It's the neutral field working. The system is releasing what didn't need to be stored. The tendency is to interpret this discomfort as a sign that the practice isn't working, and then seek more distraction, more noise, more activity. The most productive movement, though counterintuitive, is to remain with the discomfort, not to plunge into it dramatically, but not to flee it. Observe. Allow the system to process what was repressed. With time, the discomfort passes, and the field that remains is genuinely cleaner. There's a relational dimension of this worth examining. When you operate from the neutral field in interactions with other people, something specific happens. You stop projecting. Projection is when you treat another person according to the role they play in your internal patterns, instead of who they really are in that moment. You speak with your partner but are actually responding to a version constructed over years of patterns. You interact with a colleague but are responding to an archetype that formed from past experiences. This isn't your fault. It's how pattern recognition systems work. The brain is efficient, categorizes, predicts, reacts from established patterns. The neutral field doesn't disable this function. You need it to function, but it creates a space, even if brief, between the pattern and the response. And in that space, you can see what's actually present in the person before you, instead of merely confirming what you already expected to see. And relationships, all of them, respond to this perceptibly. When someone feels they're being seen without the filter of old patterns, something changes in the dynamic. The rigidity of roles begins to flex. New possibilities appear where before there was fixed script. The null state emerged from the necessity to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it's a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment and not through tension. For those who feel this investigation makes sense and want to go deeper, there's a path of deepening available. It's not mandatory. It's not for everyone. It's for those who recognize that what was described here isn't just concept, but something that resonates with an experience that already existed without a name. The link is in the pinned comment. No pressure. Only availability for those who feel it's time to go further. I'll close in a way that might seem strange for content about internal practice. I'm not going to ask you to do anything. No exercise. No 5 steps. No list of actions. Because any action I suggest now will be interpreted by the system from the state you're in. And if you're in a pattern of effort, the action will be executed in a pattern of effort, with all the consequences that implies. What I can offer is a final observation. At some point, today, tomorrow, next week, the noise of your mind will lower, even if it's for seconds, even if it's involuntary. There will be an interval. In that interval, do nothing. Don't immediately fill it. Don't start planning. Don't evaluate what just happened. Simply allow the interval to exist. That's the beginning, not as technique, as recognition of something that was always available, but that was rarely permitted to simply be what it is. And from that recognition, without additional effort, without overlaid technique, the system begins to learn. Not because you taught it, but because you stopped, for a moment, teaching it that it needs more effort to exist. If this touched something in you, if there's a word that defines what you feel internally right now, write it in the comments. Can be silence, can be neutrality, can be coherence, can be any word that's genuinely yours. Write your name too, just that. No need to explain. The word already says it.